In the early hours of 15th of November 1942, Admiral Willis Lee heard a range call that should have been impossible in the pitch-black waters of Iron Bottom Sound. A Japanese battleship, Kirishima, was detected at 8,400 yards by Washington's SG radar. Even though the enemy had spent decades perfecting night combat that relied entirely on optics and deception. Japan had crushed Allied ships at Savo Island, ambushed fleets across the slot, and dominated darkness with long-lance torpedoes that struck from beyond visual range. But tonight, for the first time, the advantage flipped. Washington could see through darkness. Kirishima could not. Lee knew instantly that if the readings were true, he held a weapon no Japanese commander had ever faced. Mathematical accuracy in a world built on guesswork. That divide between what eyes saw and what instruments revealed was new. For 2 decades, night combat in the Pacific had been a Japanese specialty. Destroyer and cruiser crews had trained obsessively for low-light fighting, relying on excellent binoculars, fine optical rangefinders, and Type 93 long-lance torpedoes that outranged anything the Allies carried. American task forces had already paid for underestimating that advantage at Savo Island, and again in the first brutal night action off Guadalcanal on 13th of November, where formations degenerated into close-range brawls lit by searchlights and sudden explosions. Task Force 64 had entered Iron Bottom Sound to prevent yet another Japanese bombardment of Henderson Field with 2 new fast battleships, Washington and South Dakota, and 4 destroyers. By midnight, the price of that mission was obvious. 4 destroyers were sinking or crippled. South Dakota had suffered a cascading electrical failure that temporarily robbed her of radar, main fire control, and much of her internal communications. When she reappeared, it would be under concentrated Japanese fire. For the moment, Japanese searchlights probed only wreckage and burning oil. From their vantage point, the American resistance looked broken. They had not counted on Washington remaining unseen. On Washington's bridge, Rear Admiral Willis A. Lee stood next to Captain Glenn Davis, headset pressed to his ear, listening to a calm stream of range and bearing figures. Each number represented a pulse of radio energy that had gone out, struck metal in the darkness, and returned to a receiving antenna. The SG search set gave Washington the wider tactical picture. Mark III fire control radars mounted on the main battery directors provided precise ranges to whatever target the directors tracked. Analog rangekeepers deep below took those inputs, added Washington's own course and speed, and continuously calculated where the 16-inch guns would need to point for shells fired now to arrive where the target would be tens of seconds later. Lee understood those systems in unusual depth for a flag officer, while many senior commanders still treated radar as an experimental supplement to traditional optics. He had spent the last year reorganizing Washington's procedures around it. In training off Casco Bay, he had required the ship to fire full main battery salvos at night under radar control alone. The splashes had fallen close enough to convince him that electronics, not eyesight, would decide future night engagements. If someone was willing to trust them completely, there would be no controlled environment tonight. Somewhere ahead beyond the low black mass of Savo Island and the flickering light of sinking destroyers, Vice Admiral Nobutak Kondo's bombardment force was still trying to reach Guadalcanal. Among his ships was the battlecruiser-turned-battleship Kirishima, with 8 14-inch guns and heavy cruisers and destroyers carrying long-lance torpedoes that could cripple even a battleship with a single hit. If they reached Henderson Field and smashed it, the Marines on Guadalcanal would lose their only reliable air cover. Washington's radar operators updated their plots every few seconds. The large contact believed to be Kirishima held a steady course at modest speed, turning slightly north of east. Range ticked downward in measured steps. 8,000 yards, 7,600, 7,200. Each new report tightened the firing solution and moved Washington closer to the envelope, where her 16-inch guns could strike with maximum effect, still without a single visual sighting. Everything about the coming minutes would hinge on accepting that what no one could see with the naked eye was more reliable than anything visible through a glass. If the radar sets and mechanical computers were accurate, Washington now had the one advantage Japan had enjoyed in every previous night battle: the ability to find and hit before being found. If they were wrong, Lee would be driving his ship straight into concentrated fire in waters already littered with American dead. In the dim light of the bridge, surrounded by softly glowing instruments and the quiet murmur of reports, Lee chose to trust the numbers. The unseen contact continued to glide closer across the radar scope. With every sweep of the antenna, the firing solution sharpened and the window for decision narrowed. The order he was about to give would test not only a battleship and her crew, but the very idea of how modern fleets would fight once darkness fell. Long before Washington's radar screens ever lit up in Iron Bottom Sound, the Imperial Japanese Navy had been preparing for nights exactly like this. In the 1920s and 1930s, Japanese planners accepted a hard reality. They could not match American shipbuilding ton for ton. If war came, the United States would eventually outproduce them in hulls, guns, and aircraft. To offset that industrial disadvantage, Japanese officers looked for an environment where numbers mattered less, where training and nerve could compensate. They chose the night, on the inland seas and coastal waters of Japan. Destroyer and cruiser crews spent year after year running exercises in darkness. Gunnery officers practiced firing with only dim silhouettes to guide them. Torpedo crews learned to judge range and bearing by sound and timing when optics failed. Lookouts were drilled to recognize ship types at a glance from faint outlines against low horizons. Optical engineers supplied some of the best binoculars and rangefinders in the world. In classroom lectures and wardroom discussions, a central theme emerged. If Japan could control night fighting, it could cut down American forces in a series of sharp, uneven blows before industrial strength could take full effect. By 1942, that doctrine had been validated repeatedly. In August at Savo Island, Japanese cruisers and destroyers had slipped through the dark into an Allied screening force and torn it apart in less than an hour, sinking 4 heavy cruisers for minimal loss. American ships carried early SC air search radar, but those sets were crude, their displays difficult to interpret, and their operators had little authority. Warnings either arrived too late, sounded uncertain, or were overridden by officers who trusted their eyes more than green traces on oscilloscope tubes. When lookouts finally reported silhouettes, Japanese long-range torpedoes were already in the water. The pattern repeated in smaller forms. At Tassafaronga, at various night skirmishes up and down the slot, Japanese destroyer groups used their Type 93 torpedoes to devastating effect. The Long Lance, running fast and far on oxygen-enriched fuel and leaving almost no wake, could be fired from well beyond ranges where Allied gunners expected danger. Japanese captains, confident from endless training, were willing to close aggressively under cover of darkness, fire spreads of torpedoes, and turn away before enemy formations fully understood what was happening. For American sailors arriving in the South Pacific through 1942, this reputation became almost a force of nature. Night meant Japanese initiative. Night meant shells falling from unseen guns, torpedoes striking without warning, bridges suddenly outlined in searchlights. Reports flowed back to Washington and Pearl Harbor, describing confusing melees where radar, when present, had detected something, but not clearly enough and not soon enough to change decisions made by officers raised in the age of optical gunnery. Guadalcanal hardened that impression. From August onward, the island became the pivot of the campaign. Whoever held Henderson Field could base aircraft there to threaten shipping along the sea lanes. Whoever lost it would see supplies interdicted and reinforcements starved. The Japanese tried repeatedly to neutralize the airfield with bombardments from battleships and heavy cruisers. Each attempt meant running the gauntlet of American surface forces in waters already filling with wreckage, soon to be nicknamed Iron Bottom Sound. On the night of 13th of November, a mixed American cruiser-destroyer force had blundered into a superior Japanese group at almost point-blank range. The resulting action was a chaotic storm of searchlights, crossing fires, and misidentifications. 2 American admirals died in that brawl. Several cruisers and destroyers were lost. The Japanese bombardment mission failed, but only because damage and confusion had disrupted their formation as badly as the Americans. The lesson many drew from that night was grim. Even when the United States fought Japan to a standstill after dark, it did so at a cost it could not afford to repeat indefinitely. By mid-November, both sides understood the stakes. If the Japanese could finally smash Henderson Field, land heavy reinforcements, and push the Marines back into the sea, the first major American offensive in the Pacific would collapse. If the Americans could keep the airfield operating, Japanese attempts to resupply their own troops would grow ever more dangerous. Night actions in and around Guadalcanal were no longer isolated engagements. They were the hinge on which the entire campaign turned. Into this environment steamed Kondo's force with Kirishima at its heart, confident that darkness still favored Japan. Their doctrine assumed that any American resistance would depend on human lookouts and optical instruments, the same tools they had outclassed for 20 years. They had no reason to suspect that one American battleship now approaching from the south could track them through cloud, rain, and utter blackness with an accuracy no rangefinder could match. Aboard Washington, that difference had already begun to shape decisions. Radar alone would not win the coming battle. Technology never operated in a vacuum. But without it, Task Force 64 would have been sailing blind into waters where the Japanese had every advantage. As the blips on Washington's screens drifted slowly together and plots tightened, the long arc of Japanese night-fighting doctrine was about to meet an opponent that did not need light at all. If you're enjoying this documentary, please like the video and share it with fellow World War II enthusiasts. Hit subscribe as well. Your support really matters and keeps this channel moving forward. Years before Willis Lee ever stood in the dim glow of Washington's bridge, absorbing radar reports through a headset while the fate of a campaign turned in the darkness outside, he had already begun dismantling one of the oldest assumptions in naval warfare, that accuracy depended on eyesight. In an age when battleship gunnery was still shaped by the legacy of Jutland in the First World War, when commanders trusted optics, visual spotting, and the human eye above all, Lee had quietly built a different foundation. His understanding of precision had been shaped not by tradition, but by mathematics, physics, and an almost obsessive belief that machines could augment and eventually surpass human senses. As a young officer, Lee won 7 Olympic shooting medals, not because he had better eyesight than his competitors, but because he understood the tiny variables most people never perceived. He calculated how a rising breeze altered a bullet's drift, how temperature changed powder burn rates, how humidity bent trajectories just slightly enough to matter. That instinct, to look for measurable truth beneath deceptive appearances, followed him into the Navy and soon became the hallmark of his approach to gunnery. During the interwar years, while many officers treated fire control systems as complicated boxes best left to technicians, Lee spent long hours studying the Ford Instrument Company's Mark 1A rangekeepers. These mechanical computers, filled with gears, cams, and flywheels, took continuous inputs of range, bearing, target speed, and wind corrections. When properly fed and maintained, they could compute a firing solution far faster and more accurately than any human estimate. Lee pushed to integrate them fully into fleet training. He insisted that gunnery crews rehearse scenarios where visibility was poor and where optical rangefinders were useless. For Lee, technology was not the backup. It was the primary method. But the Navy of the 1930s was conservative. Doctrine emphasized daylight fighting, line-of-battle maneuvering, and gunnery at ranges where optical spotting still worked. Even as radar experiments progressed in the late 1930s, few officers considered the devices ready for combat. Early sets were fragile and required skilled interpretation. A green trace on an oscilloscope was still unfamiliar territory for men trained to trust their binoculars and instinct. Then came the British magnetron breakthrough in 1940, enabling microwave radar with far greater resolution. Lee grasped the implications faster than most. These wavelengths could detect ships with crisp range accuracy, even in heavy weather and at night. Washington was fitted with an SG surface search set that provided wide area detection and Mark III FC radars that tied directly into her main battery directors. To many, they were new tools. To Lee, they were the future of naval warfare. His training regimen reflected that belief. While other ships drilled in traditional optical gunnery, Washington's crew practiced full battery salvos at night under radar control alone. They learned how to trust the numbers, how to interpret slight fluctuations, and how to integrate radar ranges with the rangekeepers' continuously updated algorithms. Radar officers were given authority. Director crews rehearsed transitions from search to track without delay. Washington became one of the few battleships in the Pacific where radar and fire control were not separate systems. They were a single, coherent machine. This distinction mattered profoundly on 14 hours 15 November. In the confusing night actions that characterized the Guadalcanal campaign, misidentification, hesitation, and human uncertainty repeatedly led American formations into disaster. But Lee had shaped Washington into something that could sidestep those weaknesses. The ship did not depend on moonlight or visible silhouettes. It did not need to see a target's superstructure or confirm a bearing through optics. The data on the screens inside Washington's plotting rooms carried more authority than human eyesight could offer in the pitch-black waters around Savo Island. Now, as destroyers burned and South Dakota vanished into a tangle of failures, Lee's career-long argument was about to be tested. The radar traces were steady. The contact's speed and heading remained consistent. The range slipped downward in clean intervals. For years, he had argued that electronic senses would one day outclass human vision. Tonight, that belief moved from theory to necessity. The conditions, darkness, confusion, exhaustion, were exactly where doctrine said Japan held the decisive edge. Yet for Washington, the darkness was not blindness. It was a cloak. Lee waited, knowing that once the moment arrived, hesitation would be fatal. Every number fed into the plotting tables brought him closer to a decision that could either vindicate decades of preparation or expose the limits of technology under fire. Ahead, the enemy battleship he could not see with his eyes moved ever deeper into the firing envelope Washington had already mapped in absolute precision. The man who had learned to see in the dark long before radar existed now prepared to act. And with him, the entire future of night combat hung in the balance. Ahead of Washington, 4 American destroyers, Walker, Benham, Preston, and Gwynn, advanced into the narrow waters between Guadalcanal and Savo Island. They formed a thin, fragile barrier intended to intercept Japanese ships before they could threaten the battleships behind them. The men aboard these destroyers understood their role with a clarity sharpened by weeks of brutal fighting. In a night engagement against Japanese forces, survival was not guaranteed. Their task was to absorb the first blows, disrupt the enemy formation, and buy precious minutes for Washington and South Dakota to enter the fight on their own terms. Japanese doctrine made this a deadly assignment. Kondo's screening destroyers, trained for night attacks and equipped with Type 93 long-lance torpedoes, moved with the confidence of crews who had spent years mastering low-light combat. They detected the American line at roughly 11,000 yards, well before the Americans saw them, and Ayanami, positioned ahead of the Japanese column, launched a spread of torpedoes. Running fast and silently on oxygen-enriched fuel, they created no telltale wake. Their approach would remain invisible until impact. Moments later, Japanese searchlights cut through the darkness and found Walker. The effect was immediate and brutal. Concentrated fire from multiple Japanese ships hammered her superstructure. Within minutes, her forward magazine detonated, blowing out the bridge and killing many of the officers. Preston suffered a similar fate. Illuminated under intersecting beams, she took repeated hits from medium and heavy guns. A single torpedo cracked her keel. She rolled and sank, leaving only scattered debris behind. Benham, maneuvering to avoid the wreckage, lost her bow entirely to a long lance. Miraculously, she remained afloat, her crew fighting to keep her stern above water. Gwynn alone maintained some ability to return fire, weaving through the burning remnants of the screen while launching salvos at the advancing Japanese ships. 15 minutes. That was all it took for the screen to collapse. Japanese doctrine, meticulous, aggressive, and honed through decades of preparation, performed exactly as intended. The destroyers had been overwhelmed before Washington ever fired a shot, yet their destruction was not meaningless. Those minutes were enough to disrupt the Japanese formation, just long enough for Kondo's attention to lock onto the wrong threat. The fires from Walker and Preston illuminated the scene in a chaotic glow. Japanese gunners, seeing the silhouette of a larger ship behind the wreckage, believed they had found the primary American force. South Dakota, emerging from her electrical casualty at an unfortunate angle, became the immediate focus of their searchlights and gunfire. This misdirection was the thin margin Washington needed. While South Dakota absorbed the full intensity of Japanese firepower at close range, Washington remained completely undetected. Her darkened silhouette blended into the horizon. Her radar continued updating, calmly tracking the positions of Kirishima and attendant cruisers. In the Japanese perspective, the destroyers had been neutralized and a battleship was already disabled. The battle seemed nearly won, but that perception ignored the one variable Japanese night doctrine had never accounted for: an enemy that could fight without light. While the destroyers died buying time and South Dakota struggled against cascading systems failures, Washington advanced silently on a converging course with Kirishima. The Japanese searchlight swept over fires and shadows, not realizing a fully operational American battleship was slipping into a position from which it could strike unseen. The sacrifice of the screen created a corridor of darkness, a blind spot neither deliberate nor planned, but decisive. With each passing minute, Washington moved deeper into that pocket, protected by confusion and misidentification. The price had been terrible, but the effect was profound. The Japanese believed they were fighting the entire American line, when in reality they had not yet glimpsed the ship that would decide the battle. Washington's guns now tracked the target her radar had locked onto minutes earlier. The distance narrowed. The firing solution stabilized. The window for action approached. The battle, which had begun with Japanese dominance in the dark, was about to pivot in a way no one on their side could have anticipated. South Dakota surged ahead at the moment when Washington needed her most, driven by a commander determined to impose order on a battle sinking rapidly into chaos. Her entrance should have been decisive. She was one of the newest and most powerful battleships in the world, armored heavily, armed with 9 16-inch guns, and equipped with modern radar systems meant to give the Americans a fighting chance in the dark waters off Guadalcanal. Instead, in the space of seconds, a single cascading failure swept through her electrical systems and erased nearly every advantage she carried into the Sound. What happened inside South Dakota at that moment remains one of the most studied malfunctions in American naval history. A switchboard overload, triggered while her crew attempted to reroute power during fast maneuvers, caused breakers to trip shipwide. As circuits collapsed, entire sections of the battleship went dark. Radar screens flickered out. Fire control directors froze. Communications between stations disintegrated. Even internal lighting failed across multiple decks, leaving men struggling in sudden blackness as the battle raged outside. For a ship built around tightly integrated electronic systems, the effect was crippling. When power returned minutes later, South Dakota found herself in the worst possible position. The fires from the shattered American destroyers cast an uneven glow across the surface, forming an accidental spotlight that silhouetted her massive hull. To Japanese lookouts scanning the horizon, the shape of a battleship suddenly appeared where moments earlier there had been only confusion and debris. Their searchlights snapped on and locked onto her at a range of roughly 6,000 yards, illuminating the ship so clearly that every gun crew on every Japanese vessel could fire with near-perfect visibility. Kirishima's 14-inch guns opened first, firing at a distance close to point blank for battleships. Heavy cruisers Otago and Takao joined almost immediately, their 8-inch batteries raking South Dakota's superstructure with rapid coordinated fire. Smaller guns filled the gaps between salvos, sending streams of fragmentation across exposed surfaces. The result was a storm of steel that few ships in the world could have endured without disintegrating. South Dakota's armor held, proving the value of her internal layout and protection scheme. None of the Japanese shells penetrated her main belt or the vital machinery compartments deep within the ship. But armor alone could not preserve her ability to fight. Shells shattered radar antennas, destroyed rangefinders, smashed communication lines, and knocked out secondary batteries. Gun directors that controlled her 5-inch mounts were blown into twisted wreckage. Her spotting stations, critical for adjusting fire even when radar worked, were torn apart. Fires broke out across multiple decks as fragments slashed through ready-use ammunition lockers, electrical panels, and unprotected compartments. Japanese observers later described South Dakota as appearing wrapped in sparks. To the men aboard her, the sensation was of being struck from every direction at once, unable to respond effectively and unable to see where the next blow would fall. Her captain, Thomas Gatch, realized rapidly that his ship was becoming a magnet for Japanese fire, and that remaining exposed would lead to catastrophic damage. With his systems crippled and the ship unable to deliver coordinated fire, he ordered a hard turn away from the Japanese line, withdrawing into the same darkness that had concealed Washington. For Japanese commanders, the sight of South Dakota pulling back seemed to confirm their dominance. In their view, they had eliminated the American destroyer screen, disabled one of the enemy's battleships, and driven the other out of position. The path to Henderson Field looked open once again. Their doctrine, night fighting based on optical spotting, torpedoes, and rapid aggression, appeared fully vindicated. Yet the situation was far more precarious than they realized. In focusing so completely on South Dakota, they had blinded themselves to the one threat capable of reversing the battle entirely. Washington remained unseen, undamaged, and fully operational. Her radar tracked Kirishima with unwavering precision, even as South Dakota receded into smoke and shadow. The sacrifice of the destroyers, the chaos of the malfunction, and the brilliance of American radar converged into a moment of opportunity found nowhere in battle manuals or pre-war planning. South Dakota's collapse created a void, one the Japanese filled with confidence and the Americans with silence. Inside that silence, Washington prepared to strike with a level of accuracy and surprise that would change the course of the battle in minutes. The decisive turn was no longer approaching. It had already begun. At 100 hours, when Willis Lee finally gave the order for Washington's main battery to open fire, the calmness of his voice belied the enormity of the moment. In the previous 15 minutes, the Japanese had shattered the destroyer screen, forced South Dakota out of action, and believed they had broken the American formation. What they could not see, what no lookout or searchlight could reveal, was the fully intact battleship advancing through the dark with every gun trained by radar on Kirishima's silhouetteless position. Washington was about to fire the first fully radar-controlled battleship salvo in naval history under true combat conditions. The effect was instantaneous. 9 16-inch 45 caliber guns ignited simultaneously, hurling 2,700-pound armor-piercing shells in arcing trajectories so steep that they climbed tens of thousands of feet before descending at near vertical angles. The gun blast rolled across the water with the force of a thunderclap, and for a fraction of a second, the night lit up with a sudden glare. But by the time Japanese observers caught the faint glow on the horizon, the shells were already inbound, falling from a darkness too deep for them to track. The first hits were catastrophic. Kirishima's topside compartments, bridge levels, fire control positions, and lookout stations were torn apart. Communications shattered instantly. Officers attempting to coordinate her response found their telephones and voice tubes dead or jammed with debris. Shell fragments sliced through exposed crews. Within seconds, Kirishima's ability to direct her guns coherently had dissolved. Washington's radar fed continuous updates to her fire control computers. As adjustments were made, the second salvo landed near Kirishima's forward turrets. Shock waves rattled the ship violently enough that Japanese engineers would later report structural deformation near the magazines. Fearing a detonation, damage control teams began flooding compartments, sacrificing stability to prevent explosion. The third salvo struck deeper, penetrating to machinery spaces where steam lines ruptured and engines faltered. Kirishima's speed dropped. With propulsion reduced and steering already strained, the ship began losing the ability to maneuver effectively. Japanese doctrine relied on aggressive turns and rapid repositioning to evade fire. Now those options narrowed to almost nothing. Under ordinary circumstances, Kirishima might have responded with accurate gunnery of her own, but blinded and disoriented, her crews resorted to firing at Washington's muzzle flashes, an imprecise technique under ideal conditions and nearly hopeless at these ranges. Her shells passed overhead or splashed wide. Without functional directors or communications, each turret operated nearly independently, further degrading accuracy. Washington's fourth salvo removed any remaining chance at recovery. It destroyed Kirishima's steering systems outright. The battleship began turning uncontrollably, first slowly and then more sharply as water entered compromised compartments. The fifth salvo tore through crew spaces, adding casualties to an already overwhelmed damage control effort. The sixth created gaping holes along the starboard hull, introducing flooding patterns that accelerated the loss of stability. By the seventh salvo, the end was certain. Washington's radar showed a target slowing, listing, and shedding heat signatures across multiple compartments. Kirishima could no longer fire effectively, steer, or communicate. She burned openly, her structure twisting under the weight of internal fires and flooding. Lee saw no reason to expend further ammunition. At 01:07, he ordered ceasefire. What had happened in those 7 minutes was not simply the sinking of a battleship, it was the demonstration of a new mode of warfare. Washington had fired 75 rounds of 16-inch ammunition, scoring devastating hits at a rate unimaginable for optical gunnery in total darkness. Modern surveys of the wreck would later suggest as many as 20 major hits, including underwater, strikes that tore open compartments far below the waterline. Kirishima was left helpless, turning in a widening circle, her decks engulfed in flame as Japanese destroyers rushed to evacuate survivors. For the Japanese crews watching her die, the cause remained unclear. They had never seen the ship that killed her, never located the position of the guns that tore her apart, never found the enemy that had struck with such precision without ever appearing in the light. Washington shifted course as torpedo wakes closed in from multiple angles. The battle was not yet over, but the outcome had already changed. When Washington ceased fire at 017 hours, the surface of Iron Bottom Sound looked deceptively calm. Only the distant glow of burning wreckage hinted at the violence of moments before. Yet beneath that uneasy quiet, danger churned toward the battleship with lethal precision. Dozens of Type 93 long-lance torpedoes were already in the water, fired by Japanese destroyers the instant they glimpsed the fleeting flash of Washington's guns. Powered by compressed oxygen and kerosene, the long lances left almost no wake. They were designed to strike unseen, at distances that American crews had once considered impossible for torpedo combat. The torpedoes now converged toward the point where Washington had fired her last salvo, a point she had abandoned seconds after Kirishima began collapsing under the weight of armor-piercing fire. Radar, which had enabled the American battleship to destroy a capital ship without ever appearing in the light, now provided the only early warning for the incoming attack. Lee knew the Japanese would assume Washington had remained on course. He used that assumption as the foundation of his evasive tactics. The battleship surged ahead at high speed, carving a zigzag path through waters littered with wreckage, drifting sailors and burning oil. Lookouts struggled to spot torpedo wakes in the darkness, scanning for faint distortions in the water or the fleeting shimmer of reflected starlight. Several warnings came in rapid succession. One torpedo passed ahead of the bow, so close the crew felt the vibration of its propellers through the hull. Another crossed astern moments later, churning silently beneath the surface. Washington's maneuvering was aggressive but calculated, each turn timed to exploit the lag between torpedo detection and correction. By the time the torpedoes reached their predicted point of impact, the battleship was no longer there. Meanwhile, the Japanese destroyers responsible for the torpedo spread were dealing with the catastrophe unfolding around Kirishima. The battleship, once a symbol of Japan's naval pride, now burned fiercely, listing sharply to starboard. Her decks were twisted, her superstructure shattered, her internal fires so intense that damage control teams were forced back repeatedly. Two destroyers, Asagumo and Teruzuki, closed in to evacuate survivors. Men clung to, rails drifted in the water, or waited on tilted decks for rescue. Their confusion was palpable. They had heard Washington's guns, seen the effects, felt the tremors of impact, but they had never located the enemy. To them, Kirishima had been struck by invisible fire. By 0300 hours, the immediate danger to Washington had diminished. The last torpedoes passed harmlessly through empty water, their opportunities spent. Lee reformed Task Force 64, now a battered shadow of its original strength. South Dakota, heavily damaged but afloat, rejoined the flagship, trailing smoke and wounded systems. Gwin, the only destroyer still capable of maneuvering independently, took position for screening duties. Benham, mortally wounded but still buoyant, attempted to remain with the formation until she could be scuttled safely at first light. From a tactical perspective, the battle had ended. From a strategic perspective, its implications were just beginning to take shape. Henderson Field still stood unharmed. Had Kirishima succeeded in reaching her bombardment position, the airstrip might have been rendered unusable for days, perhaps long enough for Japanese reinforcements to land and overwhelm the exhausted Marines guarding the island. Instead, the destruction of Kirishima marked the final failed attempt by Japanese surface forces to retake Guadalcanal with naval gunfire. The crews aboard Washington grasped at least part of what had occurred. They had fired in total darkness, trusting instruments still considered experimental by many senior commanders. They had relied on a fire control system that replaced optics with electrons, intuition with calculation, and their faith had been rewarded with the most decisive battleship victory of the Pacific War. What they did not yet realize was how far the consequences of this night would reach. Radar had not merely enabled Washington's survival, it had neutralized the defining strengths of the Imperial Japanese Navy: night fighting, long-range torpedoes, optical training, and aggressive surface doctrine. In one engagement, the foundation of decades of Japanese preparation had been overturned. As Task Force 64 withdrew southward, leaving behind the burning remains of Kirishima, the first outlines of a new age began to form. An age in which night no longer belonged to Japan, and in which the American fleet would write its doctrine not around what sailors could see, but what machines could reveal. The survivors aboard Washington watched the coastline fade into darkness, unaware that the green sweep of the radar beside them had just redrawn the future of naval warfare. In the weeks that followed the November 14th and 15th engagement, the battle off Guadalcanal transitioned from immediate tactical success into a turning point studied across the fleet. The United States Navy had already endured months of punishing night battles where Japanese precision, torpedoes, and coordination inflicted disproportionate losses. Now, for the first time, American commanders held an example of night combat where the advantage clearly belonged to them. And the reason was impossible to ignore. After-action reports circulated quietly at first. Washington had suffered no casualties and taken no damage. Kirishima, a battle-hardened capital ship, had been destroyed in minutes. The radar ranges were precise. The firing solutions matched every prediction. And Washington remained unseen throughout the engagement, firing from darkness that once would have doomed any ship relying solely on optics. These reports collided with an entrenched culture still hesitant to trust electronics. Many senior officers, trained in the era of visual gunnery and battleship line tactics, initially misinterpreted the data. Some assumed the victory had been an anomaly born of luck. Others credited Washington's gunnery crews without acknowledging the systems that made their accuracy possible. But younger officers, those assigned to plotting rooms, CIC development teams, and radar test stations, recognized instantly what the night had proven. Information dominance had become the decisive factor in naval warfare. The transformation began almost immediately. The Navy standardized the creation of combat information centers, dedicated spaces that centralized radar displays, plotting tables, radio intelligence, and navigation data under a single operational hub. Before Guadalcanal, radar operators were scattered across compartments, communicating through layered channels that added delay to every decision. After Guadalcanal, ships reorganized themselves around the principle that information was a weapon and that commanders should receive real-time data with clarity and speed. Training programs evolved as well. Radar operators learned not just how to interpret echoes, but how to track multiple contacts, update solutions under stress, and coordinate with fire control teams without hesitation. Officers studied the lessons of Washington's engagement and began training to command from radar first, optics second, a reversal of doctrine unthinkable only months earlier. Meanwhile, the Japanese Navy struggled to adapt. Their radar development lagged years behind. Their doctrine, built on optical mastery and the long-lance torpedo, was ill-suited to an enemy that no longer relied on surface visibility. The psychological shift was dramatic. Units that once closed aggressively at night now found themselves struck from beyond visual range, unable to determine who was shooting or where the fire originated. Battles such as Vela Gulf, Empress Augusta Bay, and Cape St. George demonstrated again and again that American radar-equipped forces could detect, track, and destroy Japanese ships before they even realized they had been found. Washington herself continued to serve through every major Pacific operation, her performance off Guadalcanal shaping the confidence placed in radar-directed gunnery throughout the IOI fleet. From the Marianas to Leyte Gulf to Okinawa, she represented a new type of capital ship, one no longer defined solely by armor and guns, but by the invisible systems guiding those weapons through darkness, weather, and smoke. Admiral Willis Lee, the architect behind Washington's victory, did not live long enough to see how fully the Navy embraced the system he had championed. Yet his influence endured. Every ship equipped with a CIC, every gunnery drill centered on electronic data, every officer trained to trust instruments over imperfect vision, carried a trace of the doctrine he forged in Iron Bottom Sound. Kirishima's wreck lies today in deep water northwest of Savo Island, her hull twisted and broken, her guns frozen in their final positions. She represents not only the end of a ship, but the end of an era, one where night belonged to those who could see best. Washington proved that the future belonged to those who could sense what others could not. In the quiet hours after the battle, as Washington steamed through waters still shimmering with the glow of distant fires, only one light remained steady, the green sweep of her radar, circling rhythmically, marking a world transformed by a single night in the Solomons. That silent sweep would guide fleets long after the guns of Guadalcanal fell silent. If you've made it this far, you're one of us, searching for the truth behind the headlines and the courage behind the silence. Subscribe to the channel, and let's keep exploring the hidden wars, secret operations, and untold fates that shape the world we live in.